It's a pleasure to be here. I thought it would only be appropriate for a Shavuot learning in an institution which is named after Solomon Schechter to begin with a piece of music which we learn from the Geniza, from the Cairo Geniza, which was actually discovered by Rabbi Solomon Schechter. And therefore, we're going to begin in 1918 when a certain fragment was discovered in the Cairo Geniza. I hope you can all see it here. We see here some Hebrew script, and above the script we see a few little squiggles. It almost looks a bit like Arta Mea Mikra. These are noims. Noims are sort of early Western and Eastern systems of musical notations which were prior to the regular five-line staff notation which we know from our Western notation today. So this is before that, which means in a way it's kind of over every word we have kind of a system which is giving us a hint of what that tune should be. But this was quite puzzling because the script, and the Hebrew script, is an Oriental Hebrew script, which was well known in the Middle East, whereas the notation, the noim notation, noims, these are the little squiggles, they were typical of the Lombardic or Benventane school of notation, which was popular in northern Italy. So for many scholars, this was really not clear. How could it be that we have this typical Hebrew script, which is known around the Orient, but the noims are using a European system of notation, which was not known in this area of the world? And so one of the solutions to this question comes to us when we begin to discover the name and more about the person who actually was the scribe who wrote down this. So the scribe who wrote all this down is called Ovadia Hager, or Ovadia the Norman Proselyte, and he actually was a Catholic priest. He originated in northern Italy, Oppiodo Luciano, Italy, to a Norman family, and his name originally was Johannes or Giovanni, depending on where you'd like to pronounce your the same word, either in the French or in the German or in the Italian context. And in 1102, he converted to Judaism. He was always interested in the stories of converts to Judaism, but part of the reason he gives in his scroll, the scroll of Ovadia, where he writes about his whole process, is that he had a certain dream, and he was inspired by this dream and also by his own study of the Bible, as well as with the persecutions of the Jews in Europe. And we have to remember that during this time, this is a time when there are many crusades and terrible persecutions of the Jews, and these are things which he himself witnesses, and he himself was even injured by the crusaders. And so these are part of the reasons which convince him to change his religion and to convert from Christianity into Judaism. After he converts, he travels to Constantinople and to Baghdad, to Aleppo, and to northern Palestine, to the Banyas, which we know as the Dan, Nahal Dan. And then from there, he eventually settles in Egypt, in Fustat, and he joins the Jewish community there, and there he joins the Kehillah. And this is, in fact, the community where the Cairo Geniza was found. And so it's not surprising that we find his writings in the Fustat synagogue. So he joins the Jewish community there. And his style, the style which he writes, is very typical of northern Italian monasteries where he grew up, meaning he was actually a priest. And he learned this way of notating music within the Catholic Church monasteries. And this is something which we need to understand. These were the only ones with the know-how of how to create notes which could be recreated, was only within the Christian monasteries. These were the only ones who could read and write in the Christian world at that time. And so this was also part of the literacy, was also being able to write in notation. So let's look at this piece of music, this very interesting piece of music. We have to understand that before we look at the piece, we're going to understand that it's part of the development of Western notation. There's a very clear line here from the early 10th century until what we know notation. Our notation is from 18th century. So there's a lot of evolution going on here from mere squiggles, which are more to remind people of a tune and not an absolute system, which could be reconstructed by someone who doesn't know the tune at all. Of course, this is written above the words. This is the way notation was done. And maybe it reminds us a bit of our Tamei Mikra, of our cantillation notes for the reading of the scribe, the Bible. Later, we have more of a clear line here. This is not relative but absolute height, and that's closer to what we have in this system of Ovadia Hager in the Jewish music system. And then later on, we have really two lines, a yellow and a red, and each one is giving us a notation. For example, you see here the C. This means that this is the note C, and anything above it or below it can be related to it. Eventually, you have a few more, and gradually it turns into our 5-staff notation, and all of the little notes receive also rhythmic meaning to all of the little, if they go up, it's the short and long. If they go down, it's the long and short. And so you have the rhythmic, not just the melodic relative degree, but also a rhythmic accent, which is teaching us how this could be reconstruction, and if it's going to be full or if it's going to be open and empty. All these things are important in how to translate these graphic notation into something which can be sounded as well. Okay, so now that we've had a very short, in a nutshell, introduction of the development of Western notation, let's look at our script here on the right. So what we see here is a piyut called Mi al Har Horeb. This is a piyut which was either written for the festival of Shavuot or for Simchat Torah, and it includes 6 strophes all about Moshe Rabbeinu. Here we have the words in Hebrew, and it gives us a few milestones in his life, things which were important, things in which he led the people of Israel, etc. And here we have sort of some faint lines which make it possible for us to actually reconstruct what this sounded like. So since we are able to sort of understand the relative height of this, it's also easy for us, not easy, but it's also possible for us to begin to say, oh, we know what it should be sounded like. And here we have a modern interpretation of how one of the professors, and there were tens of professors who all looked at this and each one had different opinion, but this is the Professor Israel Adler. He is the one who did this modern interpretation, and he really tried to turn all of these noims, these squiggles. Some say that the word noim comes from the word ne'ima, or perhaps vice versa. So he is trying to convert these noims into modern notation and to try and understand what kind of system it was, which mode it was in. And so quite a few musical reconstructions have been done to try and say, what would this music sound like? This is the earliest ever notation of music in a Jewish context. It could only happen from a convert, because only people within monasteries and within a Christian surrounding had the know-how of how to use this notation at this time. We're speaking about the 12th century. And so only very few would, if at all, anyone, would be able to notate the music of the Jewish community. And soon we're going to ask ourselves, what was this actually used for and what is it reflecting? But first, I'm sure you're just as curious as I am, as I was, to hear what this sounds like. So we're going to hear a musical rendition, one possible rendition of the way that this song could be sung. And the way we're going to reconstruct it is by using a reconstruction made by Merav Ben David and Nima Ben David. So this is from the early 2000s. And let's hear what it sounds like. Okay, I'm going to stop here. I hope you're able to hear. It's always a little bit of a worry that no one can hear what it is that I'm sounding. So if we didn't hear anything, so
We
please
heard
tell me.
fine.
You heard? Okay, great.
Yes.
I'm glad. So what we heard are the first few strophes of what is later a six-strophe poem, and it's possibly written by Amr ibn Sal, according to some of the researchers, an 11th century poet, and some claim that it is piyut for Simchat Torah, others say that it's intended for Shavuot, and the reason that it begins with the Sinai revelation and not an earlier event in Moses's biography has to do with really with the fact that it's intended for Shavuot, so that's their reasoning. And so we hear what is really kind of the sound of quite a medieval, similar to even to Gregorian chant, as far as certain endings and certain ornaments, as far as the mode. And so it could be possible that he actually is using a typical formula which occurs in the Gregorian chant. So what is the origin of this melody? It could either be that it's composed by Ovadia himself, right? He comes from the monasteries, and we know there was quite a musical tradition there. On the other hand, it could also have been perhaps composed by a fellow Chazan who fled to the Orient in this time, which we know there were many persecutions and crusades. So maybe he is either giving us his own musical composition or reflecting some kind of Jewish European tradition, which he is writing down for us. And since he's in Egypt, this is found in a synagogue in Egypt, but this is not necessarily a traditional regional tradition, something which is Oriental in itself. On the other hand, in the same Geniza, we find a few more of these manuscripts to different texts, for example, to Baruch HaGever Sheivtach B'Hashem, and this shows similarity to the cantillation in which the Jews of Syria sing the book of Proverbs and the psalmody of the Oriental Sfardim. And so there we do see something which is perhaps familiar to our ears as a Jewish Oriental tradition, which is common to that region. And so it's still a bit of a riddle and a bit of a puzzle. Where does this music actually come from? And even the words, it's quite interesting. We'll only maybe look at the first strophe because we would like to move on as well. But there is a question, Mi al har chorev he'emidi, inyan kashev amod imadi kemoshe. Notice that every one of these strophes finishes with the words kemoshe. And that is so almost like the recurring pismon, the recurring, I don't know how you would say this in English, chorus, yes, chorus. And so we're sort of
Refrain.
asking, refrain, thank you. We're sort of asking a question. Who would it be who stood on Har Chorev? And the whole idea of Amod Imadi reminds us of Vatapo Amod Imadi Vadabra Elecha. So it's asking us, who is the one who was going to mediate, and he will stand with God and give us the word of God, since there was a fear of listening directly to the words of God in Sinai. And so the people asked Moses that Hashem will talk to them through him. And so this whole Amodi Madi is bringing us a kind of a hint of this Amodi Madi. And even later on, we have stories which were perhaps in a different, it is not chronological. Mi Midbar Hinhig Edri, who is the one who has led our flock in the desert? Man he'echili, nam ale be'eri Moshe. So this is talking already about the story of the manna and the story of Moshe as a leader, and using the term of flock, also maybe referring to his past as a shepherd, etc. And so there's a lot to look into this piyut, which really is no longer in use. But this, I think, is a very interesting example and an interesting way of really understanding the first ever documentation we have of any kind of Jewish music, and the way that it's interpreted and the meaning that it has, and of course the connection to Mount Sinai and to Ma'amad Har Sinai, to the revelation in Sinai. Okay, so we want to take you to a virtual time machine. Since we're doing all of this virtually, anything is possible, right? I'm going to fast forward with you about 800 years to very close proximity. We're in the same area of we're in very, very close, okay, for study somewhere down here. And here we are now in the Sinai campaign. We are in 1956, where there was a war to try and free Eilat from certain barricades which were put upon it. And in the midst of all of this, we're not going to go into what happened in the war, but in the midst of this, for the first time, Sinai is in Jewish Israeli hands. And here we have pictures of the IDF entertainment troops, in this case, Leakat HaNachal, the Nachal entertainment troupe, singing for the troops which have just conquered the Sinai Peninsula, and for the first time, an area in which something which is said to be Har Sinai is in Jewish hands. And so there's a whole question about whether we have, what does it feel like for a young soldier of 19 or 18 years old to come and stand very close to what is perceived to be Mount Sinai, Har Sinai. So this is an example of a song which juxtaposes biblical history with that of modern Israel. It's called Mul Har Sinai, and it was actually sung by the Nachal entertainment troupe, and it alludes to both the redeemed Bnei Israel receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai, and at the same time to the Israeli army's Sinai campaign of 1956, in which they capture the entire Sinai Peninsula. And all this is done using the image of the burning bush, in which God instructs Moses to return to Egypt and to lead the enslaved Israelites to freedom. And here it's invoked in a very interesting way. So we're going to hear the song, and then we'll see how is this burning bush invoked in modern Israeli time.
בשיר, בפי גדודי בנים בשערי העיר ביד השמשונים. או שלהבת יא עיני הנערים, או שלהבת יא ברעום המנועים. עוד יסופר על זה היום אפי, ושוב העם אל מעמד סיני. חלום ולא חזיון חוזר מאז ועד היום בוער הסנה לוהט בזמר און בלבבות האל של נערי ציון ורחב ישראל או שלהבת יא עיני הנערים או שלהבת יא ברעום המנועים עוד יסופר על זה היום בחי ושוב העם אל מעמד סיני
Okay, what a lovely song. So what are we hearing here? We're hearing the darbuka and the accordion, the Arab drum and the Eastern European accordion, how symbolic, which come to symbolize the most Israeli musical style of all, which is the style of the army band, something which crystallized and something which was a style of music which was perceived to be very, very Israeli in the 50s and 60s. And in those times, all of the songs in the hit parade were all, the top songs were all of the army bands. And every unit had their own band, and the band had a role of raising the morale of the soldiers and giving them a sense of meaning and trying to give all of the annoying and the hardships of being a soldier in the army, trying to make light of it in humorous skits and in songs which give a meaningful and funny feel to all of the experiences that they're experiencing. And here we have a song which was actually written in 1956 on their way to singing in front of the soldiers who had just captured the Sinai Peninsula for the first time, they learned the song on the way in the bus because it was newly composed. And some of the soldiers spoke about how it was to sing the song in front of the generals who actually had just done this thing and conquered this huge piece of land, giving Israel a bit more of breathing space. This is very, very small Israel at this time. And this new border, this new frontier, what would it feel like to come there? And so this song is interesting because in a way it evokes the sense of the burning bush. And where is the burning bush? First of all, it's still burning, just so that we know. The burning bush is still burning, but where is it now? So here we have here, Hoshel hevet ya einei na'arim. Okay, flame of God. Where is the flame of God? It's now in the eyes of the boys. Hoshel hevet ya bir'om hamenoim, in the roaring of the engines of the tanks and the jeeps. So this fire is still burning. The bush is still burning, but where is it burning? Vehu lohev bashir. It's blazing in song. Befig dudei banim, in the mouths of our young soldiers. So this fire, this eternal fire, is now appearing in the eyes of the soldiers, in the engines of their powerful vehicles, and in the song that they're singing when they conquer this new old piece of land and return to Ma'amad Sinai. And here they say, Od yesupar al ze hayom echai, beshuv ha'am el Ma'amad Sinai. This day shall be recounted, my brothers, as the day in which the nation returned to the revelation at Sinai. So again, this, and on one hand, we're speaking about the burning bush, which is not really the story of the revelation of Sinai. So we have here a bit of a mixture of the biblical stories around Har Horeb and Har Sinai and the Sneh and Ma'amad al Sinai. The burning bush and the revelation, they're all sort of mixed together. On the other hand, it's very, very clear that there's an interesting event happening. So these echoes, we have these echoes, these awe-inspiring echoes of the divine redemption from Egypt, which are contrasted with modern day Israel's brave soldiers, which are delivering the nation through their own actions. And so the fire, if once upon a time it was a divine fire, here we have a fire in the engines, very much a man-made and a bravery kind of fire, which is connected to the soldiers and the people who are bringing it with them to Sinai. So this song was actually written and performed in the midst of the Sinai campaign, and one of the singers in the Le'akat HaNachal was Chaim Topol. He was a young member of Le'akat HaNachal at the time, and he reminisced about singing Mol Har Sinai while standing at the foot of the mountain during the campaign. So this is actually sung at the foot of what's known as Mount Sinai. There are questions about whether this tradition is true or not. And he says, and I quote, "You will be surprised," he said, "but all the generals stood and cried. It was a sublime moment, maybe the greatest moment that Le'akat HaNachal has ever had." And so he really sees this as a really meaningful time when you take these young soldiers and not a simple, but a military maneuver, military campaign is suddenly juxtaposed with a event of such a larger historic meaning, and also telling the soldiers, those current day soldiers, the day shall be recounted, my brothers, when the nation returned to the revelation at Sinai. So what we're doing now is itself history, which one day will be recounted again. Okay, I think we have spoken enough. We're coming to the end of our time. And I just want to thank you for the opportunity and for your patience to hear two very different manifestations, musical ways of thinking. What did Mount Sinai sound like, both in an ancient viewpoint and in a modern one? Thank you very much, and Chag Sameach.